Hello and welcome to Sticky Notes, the classical music podcast. My name is Joshua Weilerstein. I'm a conductor, and I'm the chief conductor of the Aalborg Symphony and the music director designate of the Orchestre Nationale de Lille. This podcast is for anyone who loves classical music, works in the field, or is just getting ready to dive in to this amazing world of incredible music. Before we get started, I want to thank my new Patreon sponsors, Michael, Christine, Stephen, Venkat, Dan, Steve, Dana, Kathy, Gregory, and all of my other Patreon sponsors for making Season 10 possible. If you'd like to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. And if you are a fan of the show, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It is greatly appreciated. So I've just returned from 2 weeks of concerts, one with the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra with a program that I had been excited about for a long time, with Pavel Haas's Study for Strings, Bernstein's Chichester Psalms, Caroline Shaw's Music in Common Time, culminating with Dvorak's New World Symphony. This was a fantastic week with such a wonderful orchestra. I also had a week with the Baleares Symphony Orchestra in Mallorca. We did a program of Rachmaninoff's symphonic dances and Mozart's Linz Symphony. Such an incredible range of repertoire with two wonderful orchestras. It's been a great couple of weeks. Really excited to share with you this week's episode on one of the masterpieces of the piano repertoire, Mozart's D minor piano concerto. Hope you enjoy it. H.C. Robbins Landon, the great musicologist, once wrote about Mozart that his music was, quote, an excuse for mankind's existence and a small hope for our ultimate survival. I couldn't agree more, especially when it comes to a piece like the one we're going to talk about today, Mozart's Piano Concerto in D minor, number 20, or K466. Today, Mozart is still one of the most popular composers in the world. One of two composers almost anyone on the street, classical music lover or not, could name off the top of their head. But it might surprise you to know that Mozart was not always so popular. During the 19th century and the Romantic era, Mozart's music was seen as too light, graceful, and even superficial by the stormy romantics who wanted to probe the deepest and darkest feelings of humanity in the natural world, by extreme means if necessary. Only a few of Mozart's works were played regularly during this time period, and this concerto was one of them. And it's easy to see why. It's one of only 2 Mozart piano concertos in a minor key, and its stormy and dramatic character allowed the Romantics to create fantastical stories to go along with the piece, and to connect it to the one Mozart opera that remained popular throughout the 19th century, Don Giovanni. Strangely enough, I actually see a similar thing happening today among young lovers of classical music. I often see Mozart's music being criticized on social media by younger musicians as being too light and superficial. And sometimes I even see it among musicians who seem to gravitate to works that have more extroverted dramatic intentions. But to me, Mozart is just as, if not more, dramatic than many of the Romantic era composers. It's just that he does everything with subtlety rather than with in-your-face tactics. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with in-your-face. After all, Beethoven is my favorite composer. But the treasures of Mozart's music go, for me, perhaps deeper than almost any other composer. And his D minor concerto is the perfect place to explore that. It has all of the drama you could ever want for youth thrill seekers, and it also has all of the masterful subtlety that for me makes Mozart's music so endlessly touching. This is a concerto of remarkable breadth of emotion, character, and feeling, and it'll be a joy to take you through it this week, coming right up on Sticky Notes. As is almost always the case, the story of how Mozart wrote one of his greatest pieces is almost as miraculous as the music itself. A few days after the premiere of the concerto, with Mozart himself at the piano, Mozart's sister Nannerl received a letter from their father Leopold Mozart, who was at the performance. He wrote, quote, "I heard a new and excellent piano concerto by Wolfgang, where the copyist was still at work when we arrived, and your brother didn't even have time to play through the rondo because he had to supervise the copying operation." There were rumors that the ink was still wet on the orchestral parts at the first performance, which of course tells us the remarkable speed with which Mozart wrote this brilliant concerto. There are plenty of other stories like this about Mozart, but one of my favorites is about one of his violin sonatas, which Mozart wrote for himself and an Italian violinist named Regina Strenasacci. Mozart did not meet the violinist before the performance, and he hadn't had time to write out the piano part, so he played it with a blank page on his stand. This was par for the course for Mozart, who wrote very quickly and with that legendary facility. Now, you would never know how quickly this concerto was written, or that he had barely had time to finish the orchestral parts. This was Mozart's almost singular gift, the ability to write out his scores with practically no corrections. And what an incredible score this is, and also what an unusual score this is. The concerto begins unlike any other Mozart concerto, in D minor, with a pulsating, syncopated theme that instantly takes us into a dramatic and stormy world. This piece doesn't take time to warm up. It comes out hot from the gate. So what is the melody? It's not a typical brilliantly flowing lyrical theme of Mozart. Instead, everything is compact, tightly wound, and agitated. The violins barely move away from their insistent Ds, while the low strings, what I actually consider the melody, play one note every bar, led into by 3 pickup notes that remind us of Don Giovanni, but in a whisper. It's like the Commendatore is approaching from 1,000 miles away. And that 1-2-bar motion from the cellos and basses contrasts to the agitation of the violins. It also acts as a harbinger of the drama to come, as suddenly the 1-2-bar becomes 2-2-bar. Now, Mozart left very few dynamic or volume indications in his music. In our time, musicians, such as myself, try to be very literal about the instructions composers left us, but this can present a bit of a problem. In every way, the music is intensifying, but yet Mozart does not write that the music should get louder. Some conductors choose to ignore this and do make a crescendo, but I think it's better to hold everything in, to raise the tension with articulation and intention, to almost want to get louder before everything finally does explode. It's like we're hearing something rustling around with the lights off. And if we wait long enough, the anticipation builds and builds until the lights suddenly switch on and we are thrust into the heat of battle. When I conduct this concerto, I'm always struck by the fact that the rhythm is so agitated, and yet you could easily just give one impulse at the beginning of each measure, and the entire rhythmic structure is clear. Mozart is both making our hearts race and creating a kind of majestic drama at the same time. The melody, such as it is now a battle between the violins and winds and the cellos and basses, both plunging down with arpeggios. Now, Mozart's music is not often known for being so mercurial, but the great conductor Nicholas Harnoncourt disagreed, describing Mozart's music as being akin to chiaroscuro art, with strongly delineated black and white colors right next to each other. I don't always agree with Harnoncourt on this, but in this concerto, I think he's exactly right. Listen to the next passage for the rapid shifts between soft and lyrical and fiery and dramatic. This is an introduction defined by those sharp lines. After all this, we've only just arrived at the second theme, and for Mozart, it's a very strange one. This sounds a little more like a Beethovenian theme than a Mozartian one, in that it is more of a motive, and it doesn't really go anywhere except through progression. One thing to note about the motive is that it is made up of half steps. This most tense of intervals is perfect for a movement that is so dramatic. And of course, in the end, Mozart's voice will shine through with one of his trademark heartbreaking sequences. But even that is interrupted by yet another chiaroscuro intervention, but now including some of those small intervals from before. We are hurtling towards the entrance of the piano, with Mozart seeming to up the dramatic ante at every opportunity. What happens at the end of the introduction is to me the most touching moment of the movement. Instead of introducing the soloist through fire, the orchestra takes everything that has come before, pulsing and agitated accompaniments, small intervals, and tense lyricism, and seeds the way to the soloist with a heartbreakingly operatic theme, like the coda of a great soprano aria. And when the soloist comes in, they go off on their own, unwilling to participate in the drama of the orchestra. It's not unprecedented for a soloist to have their own theme when they enter, but it's certainly unusual. It's almost as if the soloist had to find their way back to the beginning of the movement and that agitated, syncopated melody. And now the pianist will begin to explore the music we have already heard. First, we hear the opening theme with the soloist playing hushed 16th notes, somehow making everything more agitated than it was before. The second theme now emerges, but Mozart almost immediately leaves it behind. Because unlike Beethoven, he's not a composer who likes to develop small motives. He allows the pianist to expand on the second motivic theme, but it serves really almost more as a transition to a third theme. It's a theme that belongs to the pianist alone, and it is as elegant and content as the first theme is dramatic and agitated. The rest of the exposition is now a fantasy in F major, on the themes we have already heard. This terrifying theme in the exposition is now a vehicle for virtuosity and excitement. And the dangerously plunging arpeggios in the orchestral exposition are now a bright and bouncy transition into the development. Mozart has transformed all of the music that came before into this cheerful and even heroic beginning of the development. And even that mournful theme at the end of the orchestral introduction has been transformed into something full of sweetness and tenderness. It's a mark of the versatility of Mozart's themes that they can handle such radically different characters and still be so convincing. We now come to the second stage of the development, an escalating dialogue between piano and orchestra. The piano lays out a soliloquy on its first theme, but the orchestra is not satisfied, always changing the key using the agitated syncopated theme to drive the pianist to try again. The piano finally takes matters into its own hands, playing a new series of sequences that moves through F minor, then G minor, and then finally to A minor. Each step up the scale intensifies the drama of the action as the pianist tumbles up and down the instrument searching for home. And finally, we have arrived in A, the resolving tonality to D minor, our home key. But instead of an easy leap up like in the previous key changes, Mozart stops and starts repeatedly on the A, like it will take a great deal of energy to get us home. And then with a 5-note chromatic scale, meaning a scale using half steps, he takes us home. The development was made up of that F major outburst, a lost series of sequences, and then escalating tension, finally resulting in the use of the same half-step interval of that strange second theme. Mozart has put together everything he has already worked with in a remarkably cohesive way. Since the recapitulation section is very similar to the exposition, I'll skip now to the coda, where Mozart does something very unusual. First, though, he does follow convention and has the orchestra arrive on an A chord, so that the piano can play a cadenza, a long solo section which usually involves lots of virtuosity. Now, we don't know what cadenza Mozart played, as he probably improvised one on the spot and never wrote it down. Luckily, we have cadenzas from some of the greatest composers of all time, since many of them included this concerto in their repertoires as concertizing pianists. We have a cadenza from Beethoven, which is generally the most often played today. A cadenza from Brahms. A cadenza from Clara Schumann. And many others. Sometimes pianists today write their own cadenzas as well, though this is a rare practice despite its ubiquity in the 19th century. But what happens after the cadenza is truly remarkable. Usually at the end of a cadenza, the orchestra rushes off to the end of the movement. After all of the material has been exhausted and there's really nothing left to say, especially after a long and dramatic cadenza. But in this concerto, Mozart is not so willing to let go. Instead of finishing up quickly, Mozart plays nearly the entire ending of the introductory exposition again, and when that mournful tune is finished, the syncopations take us to the end of the movement, breathless and agitated, straight to the final notes. This leaves us in a completely unresolved state of agitation, not a common emotion at the end of the first movement of a concerto. The second movement is a total contrast from the drama of the first movement. It is titled Romance, a title that implies a special tenderness to the music. And Mozart doesn't disappoint, writing a beautiful melody in 2 for the piano alone, which is quickly answered by the orchestra in a warm and welcoming way, also a contrast from the stormy dialogues of the first movement. Now the piano and orchestra are working together in this graceful and elegant theme. The second phrase is much the same, with the orchestra only serving to respond more and more warmly to the piano solo. In fact, the first minute and a half or so features the orchestra almost exactly repeating the soloist, except in one place. That sudden turn to G major allows Mozart to find his way to his B theme. It's yet another marker of the importance of the orchestral part in this piece, that Mozart uses them and not the soloist to take us towards new places. The second theme is almost exclusively for the piano, and Mozart writes a theme of total simplicity. In fact, it's so simple that some pianists believe Mozart couldn't possibly have meant it to be this spare. They theorize that he didn't have time at that first performance to notate all of the figuration and ornamentation that he normally would have put in a theme like this. And since he quickly moved on to other works and may have never played this concerto in public again, that he forgot to add it in later. This has led some pianists to insert their own ideas of what they think Mozart might have meant. I don't really agree with this, though I understand why the theory exists. To me, the simplicity is exactly the point after all the drama, agitation, and rhythmic complexity of the first movement. Now we need to clean the slate, and to me, Mozart's simplicity is perfectly understandable and clear. Now, it does take a great pianist to quote-unquote fill in the blanks without filling them in, so to speak. Mitsuko Uchida, whose performance of this concerto with the Chamber Orchestra of Europe I'm using for the show today, is a master of this. The first large section of this movement concludes with a return to the A theme, and everything seems to be at peace. But Mozart breaks everything apart with this G minor explosion. This middle section brings back the agitation, the syncopation, the minor key, and the virtuosity of the first movement, as the pianist rampages up and down the instrument, seeming to try to outrun the G minor theme. The winds play a huge role in this section, with the flute in particular playing a desperate melody that rides over the top of the piano arpeggios. This will preview Mozart's use of the wind section in his C minor concerto, number 24, which just happens to be Mozart's other piano concerto in a minor key. Mozart uses the solo winds here as almost a second soloist, totally in sync with the piano, and of equal importance. But in the end, things will return back to normal. That was just a passing storm, not something that dominates like in the first movement. And as if to emphasize that, Mozart has the piano take on an entire iteration of the A theme by itself, with the orchestra silent. If the orchestra has been instigating these minor-ish outbursts, the piano seems determined to calm them. Mozart saves his most extraordinary moment for last in this movement. As before, the orchestra takes the piano to that beautiful G major. But unlike the first time, the piano now returns us to B flat major. And the woodwind choir that was so agitated before is now calm. The tenderness of this section is something that only Mozart could achieve, and it ranks as one of my favorite moments in all of Mozart's concertos. It takes us to the end of this supremely beautiful romance. But the third movement wrenches us right back into drama. It's that chiaroscuro idea again. The end of the second movement has us in total peace and calm, and the third movement immediately thrusts that aside. For the second consecutive movement, the piano starts alone and the orchestra responds with the same music. This movement, like almost every Mozart concerto third movement, is a rondo, meaning a single theme returns over and over again with different themes in between. But it's not as easy to follow as in other rondos, as sometimes Mozart messes around with the orders of the themes and doesn't always bring back the main theme where you might expect it to be. The theme here is a kind of amalgamation or different take on the first movement themes. It features a leap up of an arpeggio rather than a leap down in the first movement, half-step intervals, and most importantly, agitation. The orchestra's response is about as violent as Mozart gets in his non-operatic music. The violins relentlessly repeat arpeggios up and up, driving the music to new heights of drama. Then the chromatic scales get a workout, as Mozart brings us a passage that wouldn't be out of place in Don Giovanni. Every bar brings us to a higher and higher level of harmonic tension, before Mozart takes us right back down the scale. The character of this movement remains stern practically throughout. The next theme is another version of that half-step melody from the first movement, but instead of going down, it goes up a half step before sternly falling back to earth. And then Mozart starts to preview another theme. Listen to the flute. That motive will come back in a big way in just a moment, because suddenly Mozart shifts to F major, and after a lot of toing and froing, finds his way to his third major theme. It is based on that motive I just played you, and it is the most cheerful melody we've heard so far in the piece. Again, contrast, contrast, contrast. And as the melody runs out of steam, suddenly the orchestra disappears, and the pianist finds itself alone to play another cadenza. And the purpose of that cadenza is to get us back to the main theme. But did you hear how the orchestra's response was more intense than before? Listen to the first time they play. And now the second iteration of the theme. In the first version, Mozart goes to a B flat, but in the second version, that arpeggio jumps to a B natural, and suddenly everything feels even more electrified. In practice, all Mozart did was to help himself get to a new key, A minor, but the emotional effect is like the fire has started burning even brighter than before. Now begins what feels like a traditional development. A series of sequences, all in different keys and all featuring the woodwinds, begins, with the piano scampering backwards and forwards on the piano. The winds are driving all of the themes here. That arpeggio is omnipresent. And now the woodwinds begin playing the theme itself in dialogue with the piano. I find it fascinating how the winds take a more and more prominent role as the concerto progresses. They are now practically the protagonists, or at least an equal partner to the piano. The tension throughout this movement keeps rising, and as the themes come back in different guises, it feels like we are rocketing towards a dramatic conclusion. Mozart adds one more cadenza for the piano to play, and then the main theme returns one more time, but only for 7 measures. The piano bursts forward with energy and leaves a question hanging in the air. And it is answered in the most surprising way possible. The cheerful theme returns in D major, and for the rest of the piece, about a minute of music, not a single cloud appears in the sky. We even get little laughs of joy from the winds. So what is this ending about? Well, some people believe Mozart simply didn't want to leave his audiences with a minor key dramatic ending. In essence, he wanted to send them home happy, so he quickly modulates and writes this cheeky little coda just to assuage the audience. But I'm not so sure. The theme he chooses is one that already appeared in a major key, and everything in this coda is present in the rest of the piece. Woodwinds leading, chromatic scales, arpeggios, and even a hint of syncopation in the accompaniment. I think it's just as likely that Mozart thought of this ending as a kind of clearing of all the clouds, as a resolution to all the drama that came before. Remember that Mozart was writing before Beethoven inaugurated the so-called darkness to light path that so famously leads us to glory in his Fifth Symphony. It wasn't so surprising in Mozart's time to just shift gears, and even Beethoven himself does it at the end of his normally relentlessly dark Opus 95 string quartet. There are plenty of musicians who complain about this ending, implying that Mozart doesn't fulfill the promise of the drama he's created. But I think that's asking too much of him, and it's really asking him to be a composer of another time and era. I find this ending glorious, a nod to the charm and elegance of the second movement, and to the moments of sunshine in the rest of the piece. In the end, whether you like the very, very ending of this concerto or not, it's one of the greatest and most compelling pieces for piano and orchestra ever written. It is a special joy for me to conduct Mozart piano concertos, as the invention and creativity that Mozart infused into this genre is endlessly inspiring, touching, and illuminating. An excuse for mankind's existence and a small hope for our ultimate survival, as Robbins Landon said. I couldn't agree more. Thanks so much for listening to Sticky Notes today. We'll have some more exciting stuff for you in a couple of weeks, so don't miss our next episode. If you like what you heard today, please feel free to rate and review the show on iTunes. It really helps the show gain more visibility. And please send any questions to stickynotespodcast@gmail.com or my Facebook page @StickyNotesPodcast. And if you'd like to support the podcast monetarily, just head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. Thanks, and I'll talk to you again after a while.